Well, I'm Rich Wandschneider, okay? I work here at the Josephy Library, and I'm a friend of Pearl Alice's for at least, I don't know how many years, not too many, but she started coming back up here to the Wallowas and coming up to Tamcalix, and we met, and she's talked about her book with me, and she did a wonderful presentation here at the Josephy Center. We had all the school kids grades 7 to 12 here. And
Great.
I have enjoyed the book, and I don't know where we want to start. I have a couple of questions, but Pearl, let's go to Pearl, and you can maybe introduce your friends. You introduced your cousin, but tell people who a couple of these other people are, okay?
Okay. Well, I only see two that have direct relationship with the book, and that's my cousin Saritha, that's Saritha with an S,
Okay.
Jefferson, and her father and my father were brothers, and they were the best team log cutters in the woods.
Right.
And Saritha can tell you her part of the story. Her mother died, so she had to go back to Louisiana as a young child. And then there's Gail Davidson, whose grandfather is the one who recruited the first African-American loggers in 23 and settled Maxville. So those are the two people that I recognize so far.
Well, Pearl, I told people to join whether they had read the book or not. And I know some people have, some people have not. I want to make another caveat here. At first, I thought maybe we'd read Baldwin's book, The Fire Next Time, at the same time, and we'd have kind of a national perspective and a local one. But frankly, that's too much. James Baldwin's Fire Next Time is a beautiful book. He could have written it yesterday instead of in 1961. Same issues, same stuff's out there. But one of the things that I loved about your book, Pearl, was connecting Maxville and Wallowa County, Oregon to the world. The Great Migration, the movement of how many of us knew how many African Americans were involved in the South in the timber industry before Maxville ever happened, right? As you point out in the book. And the Great Migration had people, and another thing I didn't know that you pointed out was how a timber company had just moved McNary, Louisiana to McNary, Arizona. And then the interrelationships of families. You had a web out here, didn't you?
A what?
You had a web of families out here that.
Well, family followed family. That's how Saritha's father came out after my father came out.
Uh-huh.
Mm-hmm. But let me can I just do a little maybe intro to the book
Sure,
and the
please
project?
do.
Okay. Just by background, I think what connects Saritha, Gail, and myself are these things. Obviously, Saritha's father was an African-American logger in Maxville as well. But Saritha also had the experience of being she was in La Grande. Her father commuted between Maxville and Wallowa, but then she moved back south. So she has that comparison between living in the north and then going back south and adjusting. And of course, Gail has the perspective of being, sorry, Gail, I have to use this term, of being the boss's granddaughter. And what that meant in terms of her grandfather's role in managing race relations in Maxville. And the reason I thought the book needed to be done is as a child of Maxville, my father, grandfather, and uncles worked there. I knew that all of us who were descendants were getting older, and the story gets lost. And I wanted to make sure that we weren't just interpreting the story, but that our voices would share as first generation what we knew of our experiences, but what we learned from our parents of being first generation or African Oregonians. I think that's how you would say it, and what it meant. And the reason I picked the title, But Not Jim Crow, that I second guess all the time, is that this really was a transition from a pretty brutal Southern segregation and racism to Oregon that had its own racism and race laws, but there was a unique experience in Maxville that we all had, where there was room to experiment with some levels of integration, both in terms of employment, but also in terms of social relations with white families. But I also wanted to dispel the notion that somehow it was this perfect enclave where there was no racial strife at all. And that's not quite true. It was a matter of having to navigate both racism and friendships during that period. So I wanted to give voice to the descendants. I wanted to give names to all the photographs that people see all around the state of Oregon. And I walk into places in Portland and there I see my cousins and I just want to scream, I know who they are. So that people know they're not just these images of the past, that they really are people who lived in the past or who are living in the past. So that was the purpose of doing the book. So then the challenge became how to write the book. And I just thought I would walk in someplace and find a whole raft of documents and then I would be able to put together. Well, that didn't happen. I had to really, as a social scientist, not a great storyteller, I didn't think, but as a social scientist, had to reconstruct the story based on our stories and on old newspaper accounts, which gave me as close a sense of what was happening in Maxville and Wallowa and LaGrande as I could possibly get. The Wallowa Sun newspapers weren't available in a digitized form, so the Wallowa History Center and I raised money and actually had those newspapers digitized so we could go back and look at the stories and what Blacks were experiencing and what was being reported and what kind of relations were emerging. So that's how I got all of the references from the Sun, Wallowa Sun. And then there's some also from the Wallowa Chieftain. But I think I'm pretty proud of the way the story was told. It's not perfect because it came from my view, so it's not scientific in that way, but it certainly is authentic. And that I think I did pretty good justice to the stories coming out of the newspapers and coming out of our voices. So that's kind of what I'll do to kickstart it. And if there are any questions or discussions, and please, Gail and Sarita, weigh in.
One thing that comes to mind immediately, Pearl, is how aware, so this is one group of people, interconnected families, interconnected by their occupations, who make it from Louisiana and Arkansas and Mississippi and Arizona and land in Northeast Oregon. And that's their out. They're no longer in Jim Crow. How much here did you follow what was going on in the rest of the country? The struggles of or even say the Black baseball leagues. Did anybody subscribe to the Defender or one of the Black newspapers?
The Chicago Defender, yeah, they called it the LIGO Defender because they said it was just full of lies, but that was just gossipy. You know, it's amazing. As isolated as they were, they subscribed to the Chicago Defender. Certainly people going back and forth. I was amazed with the mobility of the movement of people back and forth between the South and Wallowa County. And yes, they were quite aware of what was going on outside of Maxville and kind of the larger migration. Okay. And as people migrated out, you know, you bring stories with you.
Go ahead, somebody else here chip in.
I want to know, maybe Gail and Pearl, maybe and Teresa can talk to this, but I want to know, how were these folks lured out? Was it because there were fewer jobs where they were? I mean, because that's a big transition.
I think I can kind of speak maybe to the hiring end of that. And Pearl, you've done the research. Mine is mostly myth. It's not myth, they're family stories that I've heard forever. but, and you can correct me or my perceptions, but the timber industry was huge in the South for a long time. And as the rapacious mills moved from east to west, the forests disappeared and the woods were cut out, but the mills were still hungry for timber. And my grandfather in the early 20s and the 19s was working for a big Long Bell lumber company in the South. And Long Bell, which I think has mills in Washington State still, probably, and on the West Coast. They were looking for Western timber. And so my grandfather moved from Long Bell he wanted to go west. My theory is he was born in Independence, Missouri, and I think where the wagons rolled west. And, the 19th century wasn't that far behind the 20th back then. And my hunch is that he had a spirit of adventure and wanted to go west, young man. And so he approached Bowman and Hicks Lumber Company and told them he asked his boss, R.J. Long, if he could be the one to go west for that company. And Long said, no, that job had been promised to his son-in-law. So my grandfather jumped the Long Bell ship and landed with Bowman and Hicks of Kansas City. And Bowman and Hicks wanted very much to go west. And now I don't have the piece of information of whether they bought. I think my grandfather went out and cruised timber, surveyed the timberlands in Wallowa and Union counties, or there wasn't that much of it in Union County. They arrived in La Grande in 1918 to 21, somewhere in there. And there's a little personal subterfuge story I just have to tell. My grandmother loved music and was an opera singer, and she had just been selected to sing. She had auditioned for the Kansas City Opera and had been told she would sing with the company this next season. And my grandfather announced, "Dear, pack up, we're moving to Oregon." And she was distressed. And he was the most honest man I ever knew, but he, on this occasion, lied. And he said, "Don't worry, dear, we're going to Portland." So she packed 4 kids, her grand piano, and all of their worldly belongings, hopped on Union Pacific, and the train got as far as La Grande, and he said, "We're getting off here, dear." So the train stopped. And my grandmother's life in the West began. And it wasn't long before I guess in surveying all his timber, saw there was this, all the woods that we all know out north of Wallowa and around there seemed to him like a perfect place to put a mill. And so the word went out. Now, Pearl knows more about how it went out to loggers. He had experience with black logging crews in the South and knew that they were top-notch in the woods, dependable, faithful workers. And so that's who he thought he could hire. And there was also a strike, I think I've heard, the worldwide workers of the world. The Wobblies had organized some of the local folks in the mills around northeastern Oregon, is my understanding. And he did not, frankly, he didn't want to hire strike union guys. He thought that would make life difficult for this project. So that's where my knowledge of the beginning starts. And
Well, if I could jump in, Gail,
yeah,
your grandfather faced two challenges. One was the IWW, and the IWW was openly recruiting and trying to make common ground between Black and white workers in the log timber industry.
okay.
And your grandfather, I'll talk about your grandfather as an object, but he was a company man. He was not up there to solve the IWW's problems. He wanted workers that he could trust. And so the best thing he could do was bring workers from the South that he knew. And they were Black workers. I think to your grandfather's credit, he brought Black workers, white workers, and then settled Maxville as close to a normal setting as he could. He couldn't integrate housing, and I don't know if that was his choice or not. And he couldn't integrate the schools, but he certainly managed a town that had a lot of social camaraderie between the Black and white workers. But remember, you said he met the Black workers in La Grande with his shotguns and escorted them to Maxville.
Yeah.
Because there was also the Ku Klux Klan and white organized labor in the county that didn't want them there.
Yeah. I didn't know about that part till I did not know. I'm a native Oregonian. I did not know until Pearl and I were talking about her book that the Klan had a greater presence in Oregon in the early 1920s than it had in any other state in the Union, according to newspaper accounts I myself found after Pearl put me onto that.
Well, just to add to that, Oregon University, the library, there's the Pierce Library, after a governor of this state who was strongly supported by the Klan and was an avowed racist. And they're changing the name of the library in La Grande, I think, at the college. So yeah, there was a big presence.
I'm sorry,
Yeah.
which college? Eastern Oregon?
Eastern Oregon College. When you were here, it was Eastern Oregon College. It's now Eastern Oregon University. Yeah.
Okay.
I think the surprise for me in doing all of my research was to find out that the Christian church in Wallowa was really like a beachhead for the Ku Klux Klan ventures up into Oregon. And they hosted all of the Ku Klux Klan leaders that were coming out of Pendleton and raised money for them. And, and was like a base for them in Wallowa County. Our little Christian church there in Wallowa.
You know, I talked to a friend of mine this summer. I didn't touch on that. I didn't have the nerve to, but I found out that this is a little sidebar, I guess. But I found out that her family, which were of German descent, supported. Went out of their way to support must have been the only Jewish person in Wallowa County. And that was Mrs. Frick, who had operated the little bakery right on the edge of our schoolyard.
Pa Frick.
And there was a cross burned in front of her store in the early early 20s, about the same
They were
time.
primarily
In my book, I talk, the Klan in Wallowa County in the early formation of the Klan did not have African-American targets. They did have over in La Grande, but not in Wallowa County, but their targets were immigrants and Catholics and to some degree Mormons. And so that's how they burned the crosses in front of the Pa Frick's bakery. But they burned crosses all over the region, even before African Americans came there. But I would like, just even though it's hopping around historically a bit, I would like for Sarita to talk about what she experienced going from LeGrand, where they were reasonably integrated into community with school and shopping and stores and stuff, and going back to Louisiana and what they had to learn.
Okay, first you can say I'm going back. I never lived in Louisiana. I was born in Oregon. And so when my mother died in 1953, my father took us children not back to Louisiana where he was from. So I went from integrated schools to some extent in LeGrand, although there were a few Blacks in the schools, to totally segregated system in Louisiana. I lived in the country with my grandmother. We had community schools. So I attended a one-room school with 5 grades. My aunt was a school teacher. When I got to 6th grade, we went to a larger school, but was still segregated, high school. I went through segregated schools through my obtaining a bachelor's degree at Grambling State University. So I lived in a totally segregated world in Louisiana. In fact, yesterday, I believe I was thinking about it. I did not know the name of any white child my age after living in Louisiana from age 9 to 21. So I lived in a totally segregated world.
Wow.
And what did they tell you about being Black? You had come from where you had experienced some integration in school. So what did the family teach you about how to live in that segregated world?
Well, we were never taught to hate or dislike anybody because of race. We were just taught to live in this world, to be the best that you can be. We had teachers who had high expectations for us. You're going to always exceed what we have done, but we were never taught to dislike or hate anybody. This was our world, and we lived in it, and did very well.
So there wasn't racial tension where you were in Louisiana then in the 50s? You were just segregated.
We were segregated. My first introduction to the real world was when I went to Southern University after graduating from high school, and we had students who went to integrate the lunch counters at Woolworth, and that was my real first introduction to integration.
I think it speaks to how completely, how segregation really isolated Black from white lives. I was surprised when I went to the South to school that most of the kids that I met at my college had never, they had always lived in a Black world. Now it was a Black world where there was this white world outside that was obviously in charge, but that their social and cultural experiences were in that community.
Yes, when we went into the little town to a shop, get groceries, they were run, of course, by whites. My grandmother, who was in her 80s, had to be called by, she was called by her first name, but she had to call the 16, 17-year-old children by their Mr. or Mrs. My grandmother wasn't allowed to vote. I believe when she did go to vote, she was asked to name one of the amendments to the Constitution. Well, the person asking the question probably did not even know what the amendment was. So there was voter suppression going on.
Well, Pearl, you tell a story about when you went back. It would have been for Serena, for her mother's funeral, right? When you went back to Louisiana, and your dad kept no, you didn't tell the story. I guess Frank did, about your father not allowing them to run into town, to run into the stores.
Well, again, it's the kind of the juxtaposition of growing up with a reasonable amount of freedom and security in Oregon and then Louisiana. And so when we went to visit in 53, when Saritha's father moved them back to, was it 53?
Yes.
Yes, moved them back. We followed them in our cars. We drove both cars down, and that's when we visited. And my brothers, of course, were used to running in and out of Shorty's store and Shell's store and running around the county as free as they liked. And so my father would not let them go into town in Louisiana because he feared they would behave as they normally did and would get into real trouble.
You know, I always say, if you didn't know the rules of the South, and even sometimes Pearl would come and we would go different places after being grown ups. We went back to Louisiana as adults. There were just rules that you had to know for survival. It's almost like having to talk with your children. For example, I always said, Emmett Till's mother probably never should have let him go to Mississippi. He did not know the rules of the South. My son was born in California. He went to Louisiana once as maybe a 9 or 10-year-old. He never wanted to go back. I never made him go back because he was born and raised in California. He did not know the rules of the South, and I wanted my son to stay alive, so I never made him go back while he was a child, a teenager.
I found some of the stories interesting. One of them that struck me was from Lee Burroughs about how, about the loggers experiencing racial interactions. And one of the things that struck me was when they would go to the gas station, they would not let the white, I can't think of their names now, but they would not let her serve them. It was Jean and
Goebbels? Was it Goebbels?
maybe it was the Goebbels, but they would not let her wait on them because they knew in the South that even that kind of interaction could land them in trouble. And of course, she was just there pumping gas or selling stuff out of the store. There were, of course, the stories of Blacks going down into Wallowa to try and get a haircut and being denied. So there was some maneuvering that had to be done and some testing of space coming into Wallowa County, where sometimes, most times it was successful, a lot of times it wasn't.
So Pearl, I get the idea that from the book again, that the reason that most families ended up moving to LeGrand and the men then commuting and staying in the batch quarters at Maxville was more about the hardships for the women and the living in a pretty isolated place than it had to do with anything else. The one woman, who was it, that went out there with her husband and took one look and went back to LeGrand and got a house?
That's my favorite story is when Joe Hilliard, who's helping his daughter close on a house in Georgia, so he's not with us today, but when his father moved to Maxville, he wrote back and said, "Nothing out here but white people and sheep." And when she got out there and saw Maxville, she was done. She was not going to stay in Maxville. And I think just the hardship of Maxville drove a lot of most of them to LeGrand, even though there was a short period of time when people moved down into Wallowa as well.
Yeah.
And Carrie King, who has her story in there, even remembered the Basque, I assume they were Basque sheep herders up there around Maxville, and how they used to go and this guy would cook for them and they would play with the sheep. But yeah, Maxville was, some of the early arrivers, including Joe Hilliard's family, came from Brookhaven, Mississippi. And that's where his mother, who made that comment, came from. So you can imagine coming from Brookhaven, Mississippi and spending your first winter in Maxville. What that would be like. Not for me. Now, my parents didn't have the same difficult adjustment because they came later from Arizona. So they had come from winter and hardship around McNary. Yeah. But yeah, the most of the women were not going to stay up there in Maxville.
can you talk a little bit about the relationship? There was a lot of traveling back and forth between LeGrand and Wallowa. And then at what point did your grandparents move to Water Canyon, where Gail's grandparents were?
I can't, I think they moved to Water Canyon first because they came out in 37. And so
Okay.
Gail can talk about the African Americans little community there. It was at Wade Siding, they called it,
Yeah,
who lived there in Water Canyon. Gail?
sure. Well, when you're, I'm sorry, my mind isn't what it used to be. Your cousin's name? Hello, I'm sorry.
Saritha.
Serena.
Saritha.
When my first memory, I grew up until I was 5 years old. The only kids I knew were Black, and they were Frank and Amos, Pearl Alice's brothers. And they would come and visit their grandparents, Mom, Pop. Pearl Alice was a little kid. How much younger are you than Frank?
6 years.
6. So Frank was probably about 4 or 5 when I met him. And Amos was, well, Amos was my age, so that was 5. And so we moved to Water Canyon in 41. And so in my memory, the Black families were always there. And until they moved away. So my guess is, I thought maybe they had moved there from Maxville, but maybe not. It was Mom, Pop, Pat, your grandparents, and then two other families. Who did we figure out might have been there? Willie, and there was a man named Willie, but
They didn't have children?
No, but yeah, one family, the first baby, I was an only child. The first baby I ever saw was born there, probably lived there. And I was about 5. We went, one day and I spent hours down with these families. I was an only child, as I said, and frankly, lonely. My parents were busy pioneering at Water Canyon, and my grandmother, I was close to my grandparents, but who lived, we lived together. I mean, our houses were next door to each other there. But that was my other refuge, but I spent most time down with these families because frankly, it was just, there was so much love. And I grew up, I just spent hours on the lap of the lady with a little baby. I was fascinated because I'd never seen a baby before. And I remember one day I was with my mother in Chelmer at the cash register, and she was checking out her groceries, and there was a lady behind us waiting to check through, and she had a little baby, and I stared and stared at that little baby, and I turned to my mom. I didn't turn to my mom. I looked up at this lady and I said, "Why isn't your baby Black?" And my mother was astounded. But that was my introduction to Black community, and and it was wonderful. For me, it was wonderful.
The Wade siding, and I mean, I still don't quite understand what a siding is in a railroad.
Okay, Wade siding. That Water Canyon was a logging camp at one time, and there was a lot of Bowman and Hicks owned 6,000 acres that were included Water Canyon. It was the length of Water Canyon and all that mountaintop up on top, and probably adjoining lands too, but this one 6,000 acre chunk. And there was a flat spot down behind, along the railroad tracks and the river, behind the places where the Black families live. And it was wide enough to create a big log deck down there. And they went, at the time they were logging with horses. And this was pre-Bowman and Hicks, I think. Well, or maybe the very early days of Bowman and Hicks. It was a horse logging operation. And on the other side of that little knoll from Wade, Wade siding was a spot where, so the branch railroad line, we called it the branch line, had, there were rails laid through Wade siding, and they would park cars that would be logging car. They look like coal cars that are open on top. They would stack the logs on these cars, and then the train would haul them, I guess, probably to the big mill in LeGrand. There were a couple, one or two big mills in LeGrand. And the other side, on the other side, across from Wade siding, was a huge barn that was, it was silver and kind of falling apart when I was growing up. So it had been there probably 20, 30 years, my guess. And it housed logging teams. So that's all I know about that.
I think it was very small number of families that lived at Wade siding, and it's my assumption that they all worked in the sawmill operation there, but that was the railroad sawmill operation. The thing I think it's important to remember about this whole experiment, though, is how segregated these communities were physically. That even though people lived in proximity and even had cross-racial friendships and stuff, housing in Maxville and at Wade siding were still segregated. Now, early in Wallowa, it wasn't. That as African Americans migrated down the mountain from Maxville into Wallowa, they rented all around the town, including my family lived. My brother knows where the house was. I don't, because I grew up later.
I remember.
You remember what?
Where your house was.
Well, I'm not talking about the little company houses.
Oh, okay. You're talking about
they lived uptown, and then Bowman Hicks moved all of those houses down later on, and that's when people moved into those houses.
Oh, okay.
You know, Pearl, I have a map up here in front of me, which came off of the Maxville website.
Mm-hmm.
Are you familiar with that map?
Yes.
Okay. So in the map, there's the railroad separates the black cabins from the rest of the white settlement, right?
You know, I don't know that that's accurate. Who drew? I don't know. I'd have to talk to the person.
This was done by Clyde Hayes.
Yeah. And I don't know that the railroad track went straight through the town. I just never authenticated that myself. I know that they lived on opposite sides of the commissary. And there's a story in the book where this young white girl who talks about her family explaining to them that they were going to be moving some black families into the community, and they were not supposed to go past the commissary. They never said anything about don't go across the track. So I'm not sure that the track ran right down the middle of Maxville. And then when you look at the description that the Wallowa Sun editor described, he talks about this big open space in the middle of the town. So I think that the town was segregated, but not necessarily by the railroad track.
Yeah,
but I don't know.
you
There was,
see
I've heard,
on the
I've heard
map here, it
descriptions on
shows that you have the north end. I guess that would be the north end, yeah. Uh, well, the railroad makes a bend and goes towards the west, and then opposite across that from where it show the black cabins are, there's the store, the post office, and so on. It goes on down, and then you got the black school is near where the black cabins are, and then the white school is down at the very opposite end of town. Is that right?
Well, the map is, I've seen the map, so I don't know. The only time I went to Maxville, it was way at the tail end of it. And there was nothing up there like that, so.
So just to set us straight, Pearl, what did you find out about in its heyday at the beginning? How many people actually lived in Maxville? And so how many people would have been in the schools then?
Well, the school was small. There are all sorts of anecdotal reports about, 60 families, 50 families, what have you. But the only photograph we have of a school has less than a dozen kids. So
Okay.
I'm not sure how many actual children there were. I would think a lot of single men came out because they built a hotel for single men as well. I don't know her name, but there's a story in the book about one of the women who ran the hotel where the single men lived. And remember, families didn't like Maxville. And so children moved down to LeGrand.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm. Now that gets us back. You have Water Canyon and then you had LeGrand, and there are anecdotes in your book too. I think Joe Hilliard talks about, number one, I love the incident about him going to Elgin. Elgin still has that reputation of being a hard place. But at any rate, he also talks, or somebody else talks about the boys coming over from Pendleton. So there was and then there was an older railroad black community in LeGrand, correct?
It was a community that had migrated out mainly from the railroad, but they also were loggers and different things. One of the things that when you get too kumbaya-ish about the life up there, you have to look at the life of young African-American boys as they became teenagers. And that's when the whole question about race really comes into play. My own brother, who was very popular and charismatic and wonderful, the one thing my mother feared was him getting too close with white girls and jeopardizing his life. And there's a story in there about him and this young, I won't call her name, but I remember her name, that they were really good friends. She was a girl from Enterprise, and they had a bet about a ball game, and my brother was able to drive the car all around the county, and I don't know how they became friends, but when they went to Lee Burroughs to have a milkshake together, some people in the Wallowa flipped out, and he had no business being there with that white girl. And my parents were real worried about that. Now, they went to dance parties and danced with their friends. It was a tiny community, but the social relations, the possibility of social relations between black and white teenagers was problematic. And Joe Hilliard did talk about going over there to Elgin and being life-threatened by those gangsters.
So you could dance with did you say that? You could dance with the white girls, but you couldn't date them? Or something like that?
Yeah, and we'll allow it.
Gail should comment on that. Gail, your line in the book about when you're talking about Amos coming to the party at your house, I thought that was one of we weren't Selma, but we did what we made our stand, I think you said.
Yeah, something to that effect. Well, I think what I wrote in the book about Amos, Amos and Frank were as I said, the first two kids I ever knew in Wallowa. And they were a part of the furniture in day-to-day Frank was in our first grade class too. And so was a little fella called Willie, I think. There were 3 faces in our first grade picture. There 3 old black kids. And we, God, Dick and Jane books, the little white boy and girl and their perfect little white family. Anyway.
But Gail, what about our brothers when you guys started getting into high school and socializing?
Okay. Well, when we started, nothing much was going. I think we Wallowa kids were not that precocious at age, 13 or 14, but our freshman and sophomore years. But starting in our junior year, we were having dances every night after the basketball games in the winter. And our junior class was selling, we were sponsoring the dances and charging a wee bit and selling hot dogs and stuff at ball games, charging a little bit at the dances for all the high school kids to come. And we were earning money for our senior prom. And my mother and father had taken ballroom dancing lessons. So they were teaching us kids to ballroom dance. Instead of hip hop or whatever, we were learning, to foxtrot and waltz. And Amos and Frank were in the lineup. The boys would line up on one side of the gym and the girls on the other. And on command, everybody get a partner. And it was no exception with them. There was a really pretty tall blonde girl who was 1 year behind me. And her father was very often at those dances glowering at her when she danced with either Amos or Frank. I purposely did not look at my father because I didn't want to see him glower, but I expect that he may have. And in one of these, I told the story in my little book. So we were recording 43 RPM records on tape to play in our dances. And so I had invited our whole class to come for a party on a taping party on a Friday night. And I hadn't checked with my parents first, and they happened to be leaving town for a little vacation. Must have been in January or February. But Mom said as long as my Uncle Newt chaperone, that was okay. So the night of the party, my dad was carrying suitcases for him and Mother out down our back steps into the car in the garage. And Amos was coming up the same back steps with a case of Coke. And they stopped and locked eyes, and my father glared, and Amos never lowered his eyelashes. He looked him right in the eye, and they passed each other. Amos came in with the Coke, and my father never came back. He just went down and put the bags in a car and sat there waiting. So I went out to tell him goodbye, and he would not speak to me. And we had multiple dinner table arguments throughout my 4 years. Mother would say things like, well, and what are you going to do if Amos comes to visit you at your sorority? And I said, well, I'm going to invite him in. And he he played ball for state, and I attended the University of Oregon. And so whenever the Oregon State football team came to Eugene, Amos always came to call, and we always came. I welcomed him into our sorority living room, and we always had visited and until he had to leave for game time. So that's how it was.
So that's the parents, but what about the kids themselves? Were there some kids who were just more willing to, among the boys, it sounds like.
I don't think it was ever an issue with when we had our class reunion, our 50th class reunion at Donna Mae Silver's, Perry Johnston. She married Perry Johnston. They hosted our 50th reunion activities at their ranch. And on our last day, we were all sitting, and it was raining. We all sat under their machine shed and told stories and just got together. And John and Jim Burns were there. And John was the high school quarterback, or the Wallowa football team quarterback. And he and Jim were telling Amos stories, which were wonderful. And they were recalling that Amos very often came home with them. Jimmy and John lived with their grandparents, Ernie Philly, and his wife. They had a little house not far from Shorty's in Wallowa, and they, so it was a small. So the boys always shared a bed, and when Amos spent the night, he slept between them, and the twins were commenting that's just the way. I mean, he was warm and just a friend, he was. So I never witnessed. I'd like to think I would have been sensitive enough to see anything disparaging or anything mean said to Amos mainly. Frank was a little behind us, but a year behind after first or second grade. But the teachers,
I can tell a story.
Amos was always one of the guys. They'd all be the athletes kind of hung out together, I guess. There was some little kids, littler boys who were maybe not athletic and not on the teams. And they would be more shunned probably, but not really mixing in socially. But I can see, all these guys lined up in the back of the room, and Amos feigned, he was pretty cool dude, and laughing and funny. He was always making jokes, but I think he kind of pretended not to be very smart, maybe so he wouldn't outshine anybody, but he was plenty smart.
When I went to the first grade, I had, of course, gone to Sunday school with white kids, and my best friend was a little boy. I won't call his name, but he was born one day after me, so I was always older than he. And Miss Fisher had us do our rest period, and so we put our heads down on our little table, and he said, "Pearl, did you know?" And then he said the N-word, and my mother had prepared me because there was certainly racism. I don't know how you describe it, discrimination and race stuff around us. I'll call it race stuff. And so when he said that to me, my mother had said, if anyone calls you the N-word, don't you stop and think about it. You just haul off and, bop them a good one, and they won't call you again. So my little friend said, Pearl, did you know you're the N-word? And I got up from the table and threw him up under our table and toppled everything. And Mrs. Fisher ran over and said, what in the world is going on? And I explained to her, well, he called me the N-word. And my mama said, if anybody calls you the N-word, to hit him. And so she said, well, don't do that again. And let me sit back down and go back to our rest. So I felt real vindicated that Ms. Fisher had backed me up. Saritha, I know you left LeGrand as a very young child, but LeGrand is where the vibrant community was, where the churches and the cafes. Can you tell a little bit about, before you left, what it was like?
Not really, Pearl. We basically kind of still kept to ourselves. My mother worked every day. My dad stayed at the camp and came home on weekends. And so we really kind of stayed to ourselves. My mom went to church. We might have gone, but we didn't really interact a lot with people in LeGrand.
Mm-hmm. But LeGrand is where they had a number of little Black churches and the Masons and the Eastern Stars and cafes where you could get fish sandwiches after church. Joe Hilliard's family ran a cafe. So that's where there was really the semblance of a community. A life was over in LeGrand. So we used to go over there on like once a month, payday, and visit people.
Was there pressure did you and your brothers pressure your folks at all to move to LeGrand?
My mother wouldn't do that. She never wanted our family to be separated from our father. And so she wouldn't even think about it. He actually bought 3 lots and was going to build a house in LeGrand, and she just balked and wouldn't move.
Oh.
So that's why we stayed in Wallowa.
Okay.
When did your family leave, Pearl? When did they?
We left in 58.
That was the year after Amos and I graduated.
Yeah.
Yeah, when Frank graduated. Yeah.
Yeah, the year Frank graduated. Do any of the rest of you have questions or any comments or anything?
Yeah, pipe up there. There's Ann. Go ahead, Ann.
We talked about the KKK in Wallowa, and maybe Rich knows this story, but I seem to remember a story about a school principal or superintendent who was Catholic, and the KKK came to he was working late at night or something, and they came into his office, and he recognized one of them by his shoes or something and called him by name. And so the guys kind of backed out, they left the scene, but they were gonna intimidate this man because he was Catholic. Does anyone else know that story?
Was that in Wallowa?
Actually,
Mm-hmm.
You tell a story, Pearl, about, or wasn't it Ashby, your grandfather, that, no, it was one of the Woods bosses. The KKK came out to Maxville and he knew some of them. Who was that did that? Forget.
He wasn't Ashby. He was one of the superintendents out there. I can't call his name offhand, but it's the same thing. He said, you have those hoods on, but I know who you are, and you better not come back here again, and ran them off.
So that's probably the same story that I heard, different version of it, the same experience.
Your dad followed Mike Holleran to California, worked for him there first?
Yeah.
So what happened? Mike Holleran, the field in Wallowa now is Holleran Field. And I thought there was still some Hollerans here. Was that a bigger family?
Well, it was Ed Holleran and son. And they had some children and Betty, but no, I don't think, and maybe Ed had a brother. But I can't tell you with perfect description, but the logging industry went through some generations there in Wallowa County, and the last was when Boise Cascade, the big companies, started rolling in and got rid of all the small jippos, And so Holleran was actually a logging company, but he got run out. Well, I mean, the Boise Cascade ran them, kind of took over, I'll put it that way. And so that's when Holleran moved what they had left of their operation in Northern California. And that's when my father came down here with them.
My father was J. Herbert, you probably know this part of the story. J. Herbert Bate and Company bought the Bowman and Hicks Lumber Company probably in the 50s, and closed the mill. When was that, Pearl?
It was a big strike. It was after we left was when they closed it.
Well, I was in high school. I think I was in junior high or high school. Yeah, there was a strike, and there was a family of a father and I think 3 or 4 sons, all of them trying to manage this mill from New Jersey. And they said, they told the union, they told the workers at the mill, if you strike, we will close the mill. And I think my father said, you better listen because they will. If this is what they say they'll do it. And they went on strike, and the mill was sold and dismantled and closed the town down. And there was, I think that event over that mill really split the community in Wallowa. There were pro-strikers and anti-strikers, and it divided families. That event divided families, it divided friends. And the town, I think, has never recovered from that event. And my dad became a Jippo logger at that time. What was next? He got tired. He got tired of taking orders from various family members in New Jersey and quit. And he came home one day and he decided to start his own little logging company. So he did. But what happened was, and this is something I'm not sure sometimes how, well, anyway, I won't go there. The resources simply have been cut out. The timber had been cut and cut and cut over and over and over again, starting probably in the late 19th century, before with horse logging and great big cross. We've all seen pictures of the big trees, and in Washington State, they were probably smaller where it's drier in the eastern Oregon, but there just wasn't any timber left that a Jippo logger could make any money hauling, because you get paid by how many linear feet you manage to bring into the mill. So my dad was having to go to Elgin and LeGrand and places east just to find timber that he could bid on. And the Forest Service, a lot of the Forest Service owned a lot of the timbered land at that time, may still, but they would hold the land but sell the timber. And those sales had been going on to the point where all that wonder, I mean, there's hardly a stand. If there is a stand of ponderosa pine, any place in Wallowa County, I would go pray there, you know? The trees are gone. And I think that was hard for people to understand what was happening, maybe. And that's, you know, this is what's happened in timber company. And the bid companies, when they started clear cutting all around other places, it went fast.
Well, if there, you know, the story of that strike needs to be documented. Yes. Because the people who went through the strike, because all the men are gone, but the children are still around, my generation, Sandy Collins, I mean, all of them down there in Wallowa and around. And at least the oral history of that strike needs to be documented.
We better get Gary Burroughs and David on that.
Yeah, and I hate Bate to this day, J. Herbert Bate to this day. He didn't care about the community. I know all of his, he was a big, well, this is my bias. He's a big New York guy. He didn't care about our little community. And I know that there were some issues with the workers, the strike breakers and the strikers and what have you, but that story needs to be told.
My father could not stand them. He despised them. He had a phone call every single night from a Bate telling him what to do the next day, and then it would be countermanded by somebody else.
So before we wrap things up, getting back to relations, right at the beginning, Pearl, you mentioned about that some of the people got the Chicago Defender, and you had the baseball teams out there. And who was it? Kingman. Somebody managed an integrated baseball team.
Well, when they first.
Pardon?
Well, I'm sorry. Go ahead. I didn't mean to cut in.
No, you go ahead. Just talk. I'd like to. That's another chapter. That there could be more on. I think, right?
Just again, the migration. If you recall from the book that there were places in the South where it wasn't only that blacks and whites couldn't play baseball together, you couldn't be within 2 blocks of a white baseball game if you were black, and the same the other way around. It was that, the racism was that strict. Mm-hmm. And so when they came out to Maxville, the company formed 2 baseball teams, a black one and a white one. And I can't give you the kind of the genealogy or the history of that, except that it was pretty cordial. And the blacks teams would play the white teams, which again was a no-no in the South. And my favorite game is when the black Wallowa, or the Maxville team beat the Promised Landers. And I thought, who could put that name on a jersey? But anyway, and then in 1942, I think it was, in Wallowa, they formed the integrated team. That was actually before Jackie Robinson integrated baseball. And one of the stories, Sarita, what's her name? Your cousin.
Carrie?
Yeah, Carrie King's story. She talks about, going around to baseball games in the area with our fathers and uncles and stuff to go down to Elgin and play around and about. So baseball was there's one story that's not in there though, is that somebody made a decision and it was probably the company, that the black players should buy their own baseball jerseys, or that the team should buy their own jerseys. And they said, we're not paying for our jerseys. And so I think it was, who was the attorney for the company? Gail?
No.
Anyway, so he came down to collect, and they told him, we're not paying for these jerseys. So he left and never came back to try and collect. But I'm not sure where Rich wanted me to go with that story. But yes, baseball was integrated, and it was one of the places where there was more intercommunal associating in the county. And the Maxville team was one sought after to come and play against because they were good.
You played Promise and you played Elgin, or whatever some of the places.
And up in Enterprise.
Okay.
There's the Knights of Pythias. I don't know who, what is that?
That's a Catholic organization, I think.
Yeah, they played the Knights of Pythias up in Enterprise, and they played down in Wallowa, and there was even rematches.
Yeah, town team baseball was big. In fact, even in the early days, in the 20s, in the Pacific Coast League would actually farm out these local teams could have two pros on the team. so these guys would come down from the Pacific Coast League and play for Wallowa or for, you know. And then the Indians had a team when they came up and built the old Joseph's gravesite up at the lake. They had a team, and I think they might have played Maxville, and that
sure.
would have been 39 or 40.
Huh.
39, yeah, 30, yeah.
Well, Wallowa was isolated, but my favorite sports story is a Black female basketball team that came up there to play exhibition against the local high school boys. I think they played. And then I thought, what? And so I went and researched, and it's true that these women teams from different colleges and communities would travel around this country playing local teams. And if you look in the book, I think I have a picture in there of these two, one is standing under the other's arm, but these two girls from the team that came up and played in Enterprise or Wallowa.
So in the book, is there one couple where one interracial couple, and the couple went to, what was that? You kind of slid by it fairly quickly there.
It was Uncle Smokey. His name was Lonnie Powell. And interestingly, he did not come from the South. I mean, he was still Black, but he was born in Pennsylvania. But anyway, interracial marriage was illegal in Oregon, but it wasn't illegal in Washington. And so he and Juanita, who was a white woman with red hair, had to go to Washington to get married from Maxville. So they went down to Walla Walla and got married, and a couple from Maxville went with them. And then they came back and they lived. I don't know what happened to, I searched death records and everything. I don't know what happened to Juanita, but they came back. And in Carrie King's memoir, she talks about Miss Juanita and who she was and what it was, you know, what her life was like up there.
So apparently they were accepted in the Maxville community then.
Completely. Miss Juanita.
Miss Juanita.
I remember Smokey, I think, if it's the same Smokey.
Yeah, But I've tried to find her death records, and I've just not been able to locate her.
Was she a local woman? Was she from Wallowa or?
Does anybody know how to do really good death records research? I don't know. I have her name. Her middle name was Juanita. And I have her maiden name in the marriage certificate and stuff, but I've never been able to find any records on her. Because I would love to trace out her story.
So,
you know, Sandy Collins, who isn't Sandy Collins now, but she even remembers a Black guy that lived in Enterprise. I can't think of his name now, but he graduated from Enterprise High School way back in the 40s, I think.
Sandy lived in a cabin down on the Wallowa River, on opposite from Wade Siding. I remember when she was born.
So how many, Joe Hilliard went to Eastern Oregon. Were there any other the Black community in Eastern, in LeGrand or Wallowa that ended up going to college in LeGrand?
I don't think it's in the book. I don't remember, but there's a family, the Torrances, that were pretty remarkable. And one of their kids was majored in medical. He went to University of Oregon.
Okay.
And was majoring in pre-med. And this is back in the 40s. And graduated. And then their daughters graduated and went off, one of them to work with the Red Cross International. I don't know if that's in the book. I'll have to send you that story, but yeah.
Are you going to keep writing?
Huh?
Girl, are you going to write another book? I sent my copy of that book to my brother, and I'd hoped he would be here tonight. But anyway, I loved the book.
Well, thank you.
And I want more.
If I would write another book, there's not much more that I think I could do about Wallowa, but I think the LeGrand story is an interesting story.
Yeah, there's a lot to that.
It's a
You know,
fascinating.
somebody has a lot, or used to have a lot of local history. It was Jack Evans.
Yeah.
Is he still alive any place?
No, he is not. Jack passed away.
But there's lots of descendants who are my generation who grew up in LeGrand that have many stories to tell.
Yeah. And Gail, I hadn't thought of this, but you know, Jack was ended up being the librarian at Eastern Oregon College, and he might have papers there at the college. It would be worth a look.
Well, I've been periodically, I Google, that's about as far as my research goes. I Google George Hicks, of the Hicks family, because I'm really curious about, my guess is there are probably Bowman and Hicks archives maybe in Kansas City. Do you think, Pearl?
I tried. I haven't found them. I found business records, you know, where they had to file for state license and permits and stuff, but I haven't found a story yet. And then one of the sad things, though, going back to LeGrand, is there are no photos in the newspapers, even articles in the LeGrand Observer. When you search, there's some that I came across that are, you know, where there was a fire in the house or a different tragedy, but mostly it's about the kids being athletes. It's our stories are not a part of public record. That's why I should go ahead and do that LeGrand book.
All right.
Do it.
That's a good idea, Pearl. I'll help you out because you mentioned Jack Evans. I worked with Jack on another project one time. And so I will call down to the college, to the library, and see if he left any of his notes or papers down there.
Okay.
Yeah.
Well, Todd and I keep saying we're going to visit Kansas City. And so I would sure like to, if we ever did that, I sure would like to go rummage around the University of Kansas, maybe in Olathe, because I'm just curious about that part of the history, you know, if it were documented any place. And Charles Hicks, who was the son of the Hicks guy who started the Wallowa operation, was living till not very long ago. Darn it! These opportunities live and then they're gone, and you can't go back. Can't get those stories. So you gotta get them while people are kicking.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Well, it's been about an hour and a half here, and I don't want to wear people out, and you always want people to leave wanting more, right?
I want to say hi to Jim and Holly, though. Hi, Jim and Holly.
Oh, yeah. Are they still here?
Maybe not.
They're muted if they are.
We're still here. Hi, Pearl, Alice.
Hi,
what
Holly.
a great bunch of stories from all three of you. I've thoroughly enjoyed them, and so has Jim.
Yeah, good. Hey, there's Jim. Hi, Jim.
Good to see you. Listen to you.
So, Pearl, here's one more help for you. Elizabeth Oliver is on here.
Uh-huh.
And Elizabeth grew up in LeGrand, and her father was a lawyer in LeGrand. So he would have been, Elizabeth, I forgot your maiden name. Are you still there? Unmute yourself and tell Pearl your father's name.
Yeah, I grew up in LeGrand. I'd love to hear stories about LeGrand. My father was an attorney. He he was born in Wallowa, last name Hearing, Hearing, and then went away to school and came back to practice law in LeGrand.
What's his first name?
Ross.
There's
Right.
one mystery that I want to write about LeGrand. It was this woman who I think had a social life, but it was a murder that was never solved, and her nickname was Buttercup. And there's a retiree from the police department that had kept records for a long time, and I want to write about who killed Buttercup. And there are all sorts of theories about who did it. Even like Hilliard has a theory, and a bunch of us who lived around there had theories. But I'll do that LeGrand book.
Real
All
catchy
right.
title, Who Killed Buttercup?
Isn't it great?
Well, thank you all very much for this, and especially Pearl and
Sarita.
Gail for coming on and speaking us out, and your cousin Sarisa. Great to hear all of you. And Roger left us, but Roger wrote me an email and he said the kids in Wallowa schools ought to be required to read this and know this story. And I agree.
Oh, that would be so great.
Okay, well, thanks everyone. Thank you, Rich, for organizing this. And thank
you.
everybody for coming.
Thanks for inviting us.
Thank you very much.
We want to hear more
We'll do
stories
it
in the
again.
future.
And thank you, Sarita and Gail, for joining us today as experts.
Well, I don't know about it.
Old memory.
Well, we have to hear about Sarisa's career sometime too. She graduated at a black college. I mean, that's a whole other chapter, isn't it? Okay. Good night, all.
Good night.
Night.
Yeah.
All right.
Bye-bye.
Bye.